Mount Saint Helens National Volcanic Monument joined the prestigious ranks of national parks in August of 1982. President Ronald Reagan understood the importance of preserving the 110,000-acre area. Mount Saint Helens is a national park, but unlike most other national parks, it's maintained by the United States Department of Agriculture and Forest Service. Preservation of the area was deemed necessary to protect the geologic, ecologic, and cultural resources of the monument, allowing geologic forces and ecological succession to continue substantially unimpeded, as per the USDA Forestry Service. 2 years prior to the area being protected, the 140-year dormant volcano erupted, sending a blast wave that traveled at over 300 miles per hour. St. Helens' north face was destroyed, along with 200 square miles of forest. 57 people lost their lives. Afterwards, life slowly began to return to the area, the first thing being spiders and beetles just weeks after the blast. However, another life form may have escaped the crater in the form of a cryptid called Bat Squatch. Yes, you heard correctly, Bat Squatch. Soon there would be sightings of the creature, and it would beg the question, where did this thing come from? Bat Squatch, which is a cross between a bat and Sasquatch, is said to reside in or on Mount Saint Helens, using the thick forest as cover and shelter. Described as being 6 to 8 feet tall, having a wolf-like snout, blue fur, glowing yellow or red eyes, sharp serrated teeth, bird-like feet, and bat-like wings spanning up to 50 feet. It is said those who have had the misfortune of encountering the beast were so frightened by the sighting, some refused to return to the area where they saw it. People who have had encounters with the strange creature equate the May of 1980 eruption of Mount Saint Helens to the release of Bat Squatch from the Earth's core, along with the molten rock that caused devastation to much of the park and left that same devastation for hundreds of miles. Even here in St. Helens, Oregon, where I live, so named because you can see Mount Saint Helens, which is across the river in Washington State, I've talked to some people that were living here at the time, and they told of how they didn't see the sun for weeks, and a fine ash covered everything. Now, one of the first sightings of this Bat Squatch creature was reported by Brian Canfield in the foothills of Mount Rainier, north of Mount St. Helens. In April of 1994, Brian Canfield was driving through Pierce County, Washington, when suddenly his truck died. While Canfield sat in his truck, scratching his head and figuring out how to get it started again, he recalled looking up and seeing a large creature land right in front of him. It was standing there, staring at me, like it was resting, like it didn't know what to think. I was scared. It raised the hair on me. I didn't feel threatened. I just felt out of place, Canfield recounted. He continues, after a few moments, the creature's fingers twitched, the wings began to unfold, wings that were as wide as the whole road, and it took off in the direction of Mount Rainier. The wings were so massive, the wind from the turbulence shook Canfield's truck. After a few moments, Canfield tried to start his truck up again, and it roared to life as if there'd never been an issue. Brian Canfield continued on his way home, and for the remainder of his trip, never even stopped for traffic signals. Arriving home, Brian quickly grabbed a piece of paper and attempted to draw from memory what he could remember of the creature. All the noise he was making woke his sleeping parents, and they inquired as to why he was so wound up, and that's when he told them what happened and what he saw. They insisted on Brian taking them to the area to look for clues as to what the thing could be, and a neighbor even agreed to take the family back to the area using directions from Brian. When they arrived, though, there was no trace of Bat Squatch. Interviews conducted by C.R. Roberts, the reporter that took the initial accounts of Brian Canfield, stated he, Canfield, was just an average, normal kid. Brian Canfield was 18 years old at the time of encounter and not known to give in to flights of fancy. Roberts vouched for him after listening to the story, and Brian Canfield has what might be the best documented encounter with Bat Squatch. However, there was a handful of other reported sightings. In 1998, an unnamed man reported seeing 2 similar-looking creatures, one of which was injured after being struck by a logging truck on a trail in Mount Saint Helens. In 2009, a group of hikers near Mount Shasta in California reported seeing a winged creature with a 50-foot wingspan fly from a crevasse in the mountain. In 2011, a man out for a walk with his dog reported seeing a blue-furred animal flying in the sky around where he was and watched as it flew from sight. And perhaps the last known sighting in 2014, Archbishop Hoban High School in Akron, Ohio, reported an entire class seeing a giant black mass whipped past their window with incredible speed. Since 2014, it seems as though there hadn't been many sightings of the blue-furred monster. Perhaps it did escape the depths of the ill-fated Mount Saint Helens when she erupted, giving a chosen few the chance to see into a realm few will ever have the privilege to. Or possibly, Bat Squatch simply reveals itself to those it chooses. Whatever set of circumstances that brought the winged creature to our forest, one thing is for certain. Those that have seen Bat Squatch will not soon forget the encounter. Another strange area on Mount Saint Helens is Ape Canyon. Now, this area was deeply affected by the eruption. It's located on the north face of the mountain, and Ape Canyon is popular with mountain bikers and hikers alike. Decades after the heavily scarred ground was able to host visitors, people began flocking to the area to enjoy the miles of trails Mount Saint Helens has to offer. However, before the eruption that would disrupt visits to Ape Canyon once more for a while, there was an encounter between miners and ape men that caused people to question what really happened. On July 16, 1924, a group of miners, Gabe Lefevre, Fred Beck, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and his son Roy Smith, reported that they came under attack by a group of what they described as ape men. The miners told authorities that they came under siege by the creatures as they were attacked with stones being tossed at them from atop the mountain down into the gorge where they were taking shelter in an old prospecting cabin. The men described the ape men as having long, thick black fur, elongated ears that stuck straight up, 4 short, stubby toes, and walked upright like humans, weighing an estimated 400 pounds plus. Known in the Bigfoot community as the Ape Canyon attack, the 5 miners included a man, as we mentioned, named Fred Beck. They'd gone to Ape Canyon to do some prospecting for gold. Working from sunup to sundown, the men were forced to collect water from a nearby spring as it was the only water source. They also used the same spring for cleaning up and washing their clothing. One hot evening, the men returned to their cabin, and needing water, one of them headed to the spring to collect it. Having arrived at the spring, the man noticed a rather large footprint that at first was thought to be a human footprint, but upon closer inspection, the man saw just how large the print was. He measured 19 inches, much too large to be that of any human. With that, the man made his way back to the cabin and informed the other men as to what he had discovered at their only water source. Now, the other men were a little upset at the blatant disrespect of someone walking through their water hole. They thought that, well, maybe their friend was tired and he'd gotten the measurement of the footprint wrong. Driven by anger at the encroachment, the men approached the spring, only to find the 19-inch footprint in the sand, just as their friend had reported. The men started to talk about other weird circumstances they had noticed over the last few days and just hadn't mentioned. Strange noises came from the mountain above the cabin. The men thought it must be the sounds of animals, but now the miners were convinced they were being stalked by something. The footprint that brought all the other clues over the past few days together was a single print, as if whatever had left it had dropped from the sky and went back up, one miner recounted to the local newspaper. Then came the thumping sounds, as if something was beating on its chest, that the men began to hear. This really set the miners on edge. After the thumping noises would come what was described as a shrill whistling that seemed to come from everywhere. By this point, they were too scared to fetch water alone. The miners would go in pairs to venture to the spring. On one occasion, Fred Beck was asked by Hank, one of the other miners, to accompany him to the watering hole. Rifle in hand, the 2 men made their way to the water and started to quickly fill canteens. As Hank stood guard, he noticed a dark figure behind a pine tree. This allegedly hairy bipedal beast darted off behind a tree before Hank could get a shot off. But soon after he saw the first creature, a second one was sighted. This time, Hank raised his weapon, aimed and fired. Fred watched bark fly from the tree as Hank almost hit his mark. The hairy, ape-like beast quickly slipped back into the cover of the forest within seconds before the men had another chance to fire upon them. The men took note of how fast the creatures were running, far too fast to be human. Making haste back to the cabin, the men convened and decided to pack it in and head home. It was too late in the evening for them to leave that night, so it was decided they would wait until morning. The camp consisted of a few tents and a log cabin that had just been erected a few months prior to the men living semi-permanently at the camp. There wasn't much to their shelter, but it was not meant to be an indefinite living situation. The main structure, the cabin, was a small one-room shelter where the men could stay dry should inclement weather hit. As the men discussed the final details of their return trip, smoking their pipes and maybe sipping some whiskey, it was agreed they would leave at first light. With the details planned out, the wearied miners turned in for the night and fell fast asleep. That didn't last long, however. The men all woke with a start as something large pummeled the side of their cabin. The cabin was under attack. The first hit caused the chinking between two logs to fall onto the floor. This created a hole in the wall where they could look out and see what was happening. Hank was able to see three creatures that looked like the one he had taken a shot at in the forest, and they were circling around the structure. Another hit. This time Hank was able to see what was striking the cabin. The ape men were using boulders to slam into the walls, dislodging the chinking in several more places. Hank and Fred grabbed the only thing they had as protection and took aim. Shots rang out through the darkness, and all fell quiet but for a few moments. Another rock hit the roof. The creatures were trying to drive the men out of the shelter and were doing a good job of scaring them in the process. The two men in charge of firing only did so when rocks hit the cabin. Their thoughts were that if they only fired when under active attack, the ape men would stop the attack and leave them alone. The attacks continued, though, on the roof of the cabin and from all sides. The miners were doing all they could to hold off these attackers while making an escape plan. The door began to rattle. This was their last line of defense. They knew the door was the weak spot and wouldn't hold much longer. Another shot rang out and a hole ripped through the door, and then all fell silent. The men used this time to try and reinforce the door, and as they tried to decide their next move, all heads turned and watched as one of the creatures reached through a hole in the cabin wall and grabbed an axe. Fred grabbed the axe and turned the head so that it wouldn't fit through the hole, then used his weapon to fire at the ape man. This was the last bold attempt from the would-be intruders to gain access to the cabin, although the attack wasn't over. As the night wore on, the attacks were further apart and shorter, but they continued. A few more rocks were thrown and chest-thumping along with growls, followed by the shrill whistles. Exhausted, but refusing to give in to the incursion, the men held the beasts off until daybreak. As the sun peeked over the mountains, the attack stopped altogether. The sun was all the way up before they felt safe enough to venture outside the cabin. They went outside to see that rocks littered the ground all around it. The cabin held together, but just barely. Holes littered the walls and roof. It looked like a war zone where the rocks had knocked so many holes in it. There was no sign of the ape men, but Fred and Hank knew what they had observed earlier the day before. These creatures knew how to blend into the forest very well. Knowing this, Fred looked up on the mountain and spotted an ape man skulking around the tree line, about 150 yards away. Fred picked up his weapon and fired several times, and apparently hit the target. He saw the beast drop, roll, and fall into the canyon below. Taking only what they had in their hands at the moment, the men made haste and ran for it. Luckily, they made their way to Hank's Ford vehicle and back home to Kelso, Washington. Left shaken and confused about what happened to them, the men reported everything that had occurred. People were shocked at the story and glad the men were able to escape. And as many stories where events are unexplainable, the men were heavily scrutinized by citizens and the media. When news outlets from Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon came to interview the miners and get details of the story, the men agreed to take the reporters to the area where they'd encountered the ape men. Upon arrival, they were able to find visible footprints, and these were photographed as evidence. These helped make the miners' story more credible. They searched a good while for the body of the ape man Fred had shot, but there was no remnants or anything in the gorge. Called mountain devils in the story, the newspapers ran the miners' accounts of the events they endured that night. Many people saw the story as credible now that photographic evidence was taken by a reputable source. The story of the ape men of Mount Saint Helens and the miners that came under attack by them still had its skeptics, but there were also people that believed in it. The men never returned to prospecting Ape Canyon. Now, as a side note, there is a story about a group of Boy Scouts that were supposedly camping on Mount Saint Helens at the time. Many people believe these Boy Scouts were the source of the attack. However, that wouldn't account for the hairy arm that reached through and grabbed the axe, or the large figures of the beast that the men observed through the cracks in the walls. In 1978, Fred Beck penned a book called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount Saint Helens. The book was short, just 5 chapters long, but was almost word for word what the miners had reported back in 1924. Beck was at that point 78 years old and with not a care in the world about skeptics, and he told the story in his own words. In an interview, Beck also explained that he was a clairvoyant since childhood and as an adult had a premonition about prospecting Mount St. Helens. In his vision, they were able to find the mine as they were led by Native American spirit and told her to blast a hole for the entrance. The spirit told Beck that they were to follow a white arrow, and it would show the men exactly where to go. In the book, Beck claimed that all the men saw this vision and stated that the spirit told them, "Because you have cursed the spirit leading you, you will be shown where the gold is, but it is not given to you." Beck goes on to explain the men felt like the mine would let them take some gold, but not all of it. And that's exactly what happened, Beck stated. There is a pocket of gold in that cliff if someone is fortunate enough to find it. We gave up looking for it. When asked why only certain people can see otherworldly beings, Beck had this to say: "When the condition and vibration is at a certain frequency, they, the beings, can easily, for a time, appear in a very solid body. They are not animal spirits, but also lack the intelligence of a human consciousness. They simply exist on a different plane than most humans, and some of us are more sensitive to those vibrations they exist on." Next up, I have the story of Ape Cave, which is near Ape Canyon. In 1947, a logger by the name of Lawrence Johnson was driving along in his vehicle when a sinkhole swallowed his truck. Thus, Ape Cave was discovered. However, the cave wouldn't be explored until 3 years later by a Boy Scout troop. Made up by lava flow, the cave had never been explored by anyone before the troop stepped inside after being lowered over a 17-foot overhang one by one. The Boy Scouts would explore the very fragile inner workings of the cave system that is about 2 miles long and eventually named it after their sponsor of the exploration and troop, the St. Helens Apes. Tours of the cave are available to the public, but be forewarned. Rumor has it that if you spend overnight in the cave, that you will lose your mind. And now let's look at some of the missing person cases on Mount Saint Helens. In May of 1950, a man named Jim Carter, along with a climbing party of 20 people, started the day on Mount Saint Helens at Ape Canyon, ready to climb, ski, and have a day of fun. On the descent, Carter left the party at the Dog's Head area to take a picture of the larger group as they skied past him. Being an experienced skier and mountain climber, the others were in agreement that he would be the best person to ski ahead of the group. Moments later, the larger group witnessed Carter skiing at a high rate of speed, jumping crevasses and taking chances that were deemed reckless. They said that he, Carter, was going like the devil down the slope, seemingly frightened of something, the witness stated. It wasn't long before he was out of sight of the others. Despite the group looking for Carter, he was nowhere to be found. Carter was reported missing later that day. The search for 30-year-old Jim Carter lasted for weeks. Authorities discovered a discarded film box for a roll of camera film, but nothing else was ever found. A plane traced Carter's route as he had skied right down canyon walls where rangers and search teams couldn't reach. The search party thought they would find the man at the bottom of the canyon, but his tracks went from the walls across Ranger Creek and the ranger station and into the thick of the forest. Bob Lee, an experienced mountaineer and a member of Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue, stated, "Every time I got cut off from the rest of the search team and was alone, I felt like something was watching me. There was something strange on the high slopes of the mountain. It was the most eerie experience I've ever had. I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. It was eerie. I was unarmed except for my ice axe, and believe me, I never let go of that. We combed the canyon, one into the other, for 5 days. Sometimes there were as many as 75 persons in the search party, but no sign of Carter or his equipment was ever found. After 2 weeks, the search was scaled back and then called off. Over 70 years has passed since Jim Carter went missing under baffling circumstances in 1950. No sign of him or his equipment has ever been found. Now, if you'll recall, this disappearance was in the same area as the attack on the miners in 1924, and one of the theories put forth was that he was possibly being chased by a Sasquatch that caused him to take such a reckless ski run down the mountain. On Saturday, August 11, 2018, a gray Subaru was found in the parking area of Blue Lake Trail by search and rescue teams after 40-year-old Matthew Metheny asked to borrow the car from his friend to go for a hike at Mount Saint Helens. After the man didn't return, he was reported missing. A group of some 40 volunteers scoured the mountain looking for the Ohio man. On the 6th day Metheny was missing, he was spotted on a ledge and rescued. In an interview with authorities, he stated, amazingly, that he had survived by eating berries and bees. It was reported that Metheny had been a Boy Scout when he was younger and used his training to help himself while lost. He was in surprisingly good condition and was released from the hospital the next day. The sheriff's department utilized tracking dogs, drones, and a helicopter in the search. On July 21st, 2021, 25-year-old Army First Lieutenant Brian Yang, who had been missing on Mount Saint Helens, was found deceased. He'd only been missing for a couple of days. The last time Yang was seen was on the Coldwater Trailhead previous Sunday. Reports state that the 25-year-old fell down a steep embankment to his demise. No further information is available on this case. And then arguably the most memorable incident ever to happen on Mount Saint Helens. On May 18, 1980, 57 people lost their lives after Mount Saint Helens erupted. Earlier that day, people were evacuated and others were warned to leave the area. One of the victims, 83-year-old Harry Randall Truman, refused to leave his home of over 50 years. Seen as a hero and a folk legend due to his bravery for staying and trying to defend his property from the monster, this time the volcano, about to engulf his home, Truman gave an interview to National Geographic just days before the volcano erupted, where he stated that, "I'm going to stay right here because I'll tell you why. My home and my expletive life's here. My wife and I, we both vowed years and years ago that we'd never leave Spirit Lake. We loved it. It's a part of me, and I'm a part of that expletive mountain." Truman resided at the lodge with his late wife that he lost just a few years before the eruption and their 16 rescue cats. Sadly, Truman and all of his cats perished in the eruption. No remains were ever found. Also on the mountain on that ill-fated day back in 1980 was 30-year-old volcanologist David A. Johnston. Johnston was on the mountain monitoring the activity at the Coldwater 2 station that was thought to be a safe area and away from the destruction path should an eruption happen. Tragically, this was not the case, and Johnston perished in the eruption. David A. Johnston was employed through the United States Geological Survey, the USGS. The last transmission from the Coldwater 2 station was from Johnston, who spoke into the microphone, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." His remains were never found. An observatory was erected in the area where Coldwater 2 once stood in remembrance of Johnston. He was credited with saving thousands of lives after warning the Forestry Service of the dangers going on within the volcano weeks before the eruption occurred. The Forestry Service took heed and evacuated the park. Well, friends, there you have it. What do you think of these stories and legends from Mount Saint Helens? I look forward to your comments, but please keep it friendly and respectful. As for me, I'll see you a little further on down the trail. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time. Please tell your animals I said hi.